So when you think about the most devastating weapons of the 1830s, you probably picture, iron, steel, muskets.
Right, cannons firing on a smoky battlefield.
Exactly. We expect massive historical tragedies to come with this blunt, visible force of war. Armies marching, generals pointing swords, that whole thing.
Yeah, it's the standard historical narrative we all grew up with.
But today, we are taking you into a very different kind of machinery. We're exploring a central, almost haunting paradox for this deep dive.
And it really is a paradox.
It is. The question is, how exactly does a legal document, bound by signatures and democratic ratification, become the precise machinery that justifies mass death and forced removal?
Right, because when you examine the 1830s, and
Mhm.
specifically the displacement of native nations from the American Southeast,
Mm.
you aren't looking at an outright declared military war of extermination.
Right.
You're looking at a process that was closed entirely in the forms of law. I mean, fundamentally, this is a story about paperwork.
Paperwork and bureaucracy.
Exactly. We're going to look really closely at two specific documents today. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 and the Treaty of New Echota in 1835.
Two incredibly important pieces of paper.
Because these two treaties provided the legal cover, the bureaucratic authorization, for tragedies that a conventional war, frankly, never could have achieved.
And to be clear, right up front with you listening, our mission here is to strip away the melodrama.
Yes, absolutely.
We aren't here to paint this generalized emotional portrait of suffering. We are going to deeply, methodically examine the specific legal procedures.
The court rulings, the administrative loopholes.
Yeah, the bureaucratic maneuvers that enabled the displacement of native nations. And we're primarily looking at this through the lens of Chief John Ross and the Cherokee legal resistance.
Right, alongside the earlier precedent set with the Choctaw.
Exactly.
And this requires us to really treat the subject as sober history. I mean, relying solely on emotional narratives actually causes us to miss the most chilling part of the story, the cold legal mechanics of the era. The law itself was utilized as a tool of dispossession. Understanding that mechanism is crucial if you really want to grasp what happened.
So the foundation of all this paperwork, the framework that basically sets this entire machine into motion, is the Indian Removal Act.
Right. May of 1830.
Yeah, May 1830, Congress passes it, and President Andrew Jackson signs it. Now, in the popular imagination, the Indian Removal Act is often pictured as this direct eviction notice.
Like a nationwide mandate.
Right. People assume Jackson signed a piece of paper that essentially read, all Native Americans must immediately march west by order of the United States military.
But the mechanics of the acts were actually incredibly subtle.
Yeah, it didn't actually authorize force, did it?
No, it didn't. It simply authorized the president to negotiate land exchanges.
Right.
It appropriated funds and gave the executive branch the authority to sit down with native nations east of the Mississippi River and just, offer them territory west of the Mississippi in exchange for their ancestral lands.
And that subtlety is exactly what made it so incredibly effective as a tool of statecraft.
Oh, absolutely. The Indian Removal Act did not by itself mandate that a single person be marched westward at bayonet point.
Right.
The removal policy had to wear the clothing of law. It required the illusion of consent.
Because the United States in 1830 was deeply conscious of its image, right? Both domestically and internationally.
Yes, it prided itself on being a republic of laws, a nation built on constitutional principles.
You couldn't just have the army forcibly expel tens of thousands of people without legal justification.
Right, that would spark a massive domestic political crisis, not to mention international outrage. You needed a signature. You needed a treaty ratified by the Senate.
So the Indian Removal Act merely built the negotiating table. It didn't force anyone to sit at it, well, at least not technically.
Exactly, not technically.
Okay, let's unpack this. If we are really going to understand how this machinery worked, we have to look at the arguments of the people who built it.
We do.
In an exercise of strict historical impartiality, let's steelman the pro-removal argument. We need to lay out the justifications exactly as proponents in the 1830s made them.
Right, without endorsing them, obviously.
Well, of course. But so you can hear the logic that was debated on the floors of Congress. So the proponents of the 1830s based their primary argument on sovereignty and states' rights.
Yeah, they argued that native nations like the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole simply could not survive as independent, sovereign entities inside the rapidly expanding borders of U.S. states.
Particularly Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi.
Right. The context here is the aggressive expansion of the cotton economy and, well, in Georgia's case, the discovery of gold.
Ah, right, the gold rush in Georgia.
Exactly. So state legislatures were passing these draconian laws designed to dismantle Native governments. They made it illegal for Native councils to meet.
Wow.
They stripped Native people of their rights to testify in court against white citizens. Georgia went so far as to create a lottery system to just distribute Cherokee land to white citizens.
While the Cherokee were literally still living on it.
Yes, exactly. So the pro-removal argument from Washington went like this. The federal government cannot stop the sovereign states from exercising jurisdiction over their own territory.
Because of our federalist system?
Right. Because of federalism, the states have the right to govern within their borders. Therefore, they argued, the Native nations are facing inevitable, total destruction by these hostile state legislatures.
So the moral claim they made was actually framed around protection.
It was.
They argued that moving Native people west beyond the Mississippi River placed them in unorganized federal territory, safely beyond the reach of those hostile state laws.
They literally framed removal as a rescue mission.
Right. The argument was that a negotiated treaty where the government pays for the land, pays for the journey, and guarantees new land in the West forever was ultimately more humane.
More humane than abandoning them to the unregulated laws of the states, yeah.
They pitched it as the only pragmatic way to save Native cultures from total annihilation.
And that is the exact tension at the heart of this history. Proponents argued it was a legal contract offered to save a people in peril.
Right, but opponents pointed out the massive flaw in that logic.
Exactly. Opponents pointed out that the federal government was refusing to enforce its own existing treaties that guaranteed Native sovereignty.
Which implicitly endorsed the state harassment.
Yes.
Huh.
The federal government was creating the very crisis that made this so-called rescue contract mandatory.
I mean, is a contract valid if it's signed with a gun on the table, even if the person offering the contract says they aren't the one holding the gun?
That's a great way to put it.
I think of it like an extreme abuse of eminent domain.
Okay. How so?
Imagine a city council decides they want to build a massive highway right through a thriving neighborhood. But instead of officially seizing the land, they just remove all police and fire protection from that neighborhood.
Right.
They let rampant crime and arson take over. And then, as the residents are living in total terror, the city sends in a negotiator who says, "Oh, we care about your safety. Look how terrible it is here."
We'd like to negotiate a price for your house and help you move.
Exactly. If your only two options are to negotiate a price or face the unchecked destruction of your neighborhood because the authorities refuse to protect your property rights, that isn't actually consent.
No, it's extortion wearing a suit and tie.
Extortion wearing a suit and tie, exactly.
That captures the dynamic perfectly.
Yeah.
The United States was washing its hands of the enforcement of prior treaties, letting the states create an unlivable environment, and then offering the Removal Act as the only escape valve.
And we don't have to guess which interpretation was correct, the rescue mission or the extortion.
No, we don't. The historical record itself, the way these treaties were actually executed on the ground, serves as the ultimate answer to that Steelman argument.
Right. So the first real-world application, the first major test case of this new Indian Removal Act, brings us to the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830.
Involving the Choctaw Nation.
Right. We move from the abstract legislation in Washington to the muddy reality in Mississippi.
This treaty was concluded in September of 1830, so just months after the Removal Act passed.
Under its terms, the Choctaw Nation ceded roughly 11 million acres of their ancestral homeland east of the Mississippi River and agreed to move to new territory in the west.
And 11 million acres is a staggering amount of territory.
It's massive.
It encompassed vast tracts of prime agricultural land in Mississippi, land that white planters were desperate to convert into cotton plantations.
And on paper, this treaty looks like the machinery of the Removal Act working exactly as designed.
Yes. You have a formal document, you have signatures from Choctaw leaders, you have a U.S. Senate ratification in February of 1831.
It presents the legal fiction of a bargain freely struck between sovereigns.
But to understand how this legal document became a tool of devastation, we have to look incredibly closely at the fine print.
We have to examine Article 14 of this treaty.
Exactly, Article 14.
Article 14 was the exit clause. It was the safety valve that allowed proponents of the treaty to claim they weren't forcing anyone to leave against their will. The article explicitly stated that any Choctaw head of a family who wished to remain in Mississippi could do so.
All they had to do was register.
Just register with the designated U.S. Indian agent within 6 months of the treaty's ratification. And if they successfully registered, they'd receive a land allotment, a specific number of acres for the head of household and additional acres for each child.
And they would become citizens of the state and the United States.
So the inclusion of Article 14 was crucial for the political optics of the treaty, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely crucial. It allowed politicians in Washington to sleep at night, believing that removal was genuinely optional.
You didn't have to go.
Right. You had a legal, federally guaranteed right to stay on a piece of your homeland, secure property, and integrate into the expanding American Republic.
As long as you filled out the paperwork.
Exactly, as long as you filled out the paperwork.
But the execution of that promise was placed in the hands of a bureaucracy. And in this specific case, the bureaucracy was essentially administered by one single man.
William Ward.
William Ward, the U.S. Indian agent for the Choctaw in Mississippi. His primary job under Article 14 was to be the clerk.
Just record the names.
Just record the names of the Choctaw families who traveled to him and stated their intention to stay. And his administrative record is, frankly, a portrait of catastrophic, seemingly intentional failure.
William Ward's conduct is one of the most glaring examples of bureaucratic sabotage in this entire era.
Yeah.
He held the personal, deeply ingrained belief that the federal government wanted all Native people gone, regardless of what the fine print of Article 14 actually said.
So he viewed the Choctaw attempting to register not as citizens exercising a legal right, but as an annoyance.
An annoyance, yeah. And by multiple historical accounts, he was frequently drunk on the job.
Wow.
Furthermore, the logistics he set up were incredibly punishing. Choctaw heads of households, many of whom did not speak English, had to travel miles across difficult terrain just to find his agency.
And when they finally arrived, often spending days on the road to meet this tight 6-month deadline, he would turn them away.
Right, he would tell them he was too busy.
Or that they needed an interpreter. Or he would simply refuse to write down their names, telling them to come back another time.
It was active discouragement.
I was looking into his specific administrative habits, and at one point, an entire page of his official register, like a physical piece of paper containing the names of families who had successfully managed to navigate his hurdles and register, simply went missing.
It vanished. Vanished.
And the consequences of a missing page or refused registration were absolute. When the 6-month window closed, the great majority of Choctaw claims to remain had never been officially recorded by Ward.
So thousands of Choctaw families who had chosen lawfully and under the strict terms of a federally ratified treaty to keep their homes suddenly found themselves entirely undocumented.
Because they were not on Ward's list, they had no legal title to the land they had lived on for generations.
They had no recognized citizenship status. None. And because their broader national territory was technically considered ceded to the U.S. by the broader treaty, white settlers immediately began moving on to it.
Just staking claims and physically pushing the Choctaw off their own farms.
Exactly. Which raises a massive historical question.
Right. When you look at William Ward, the drunkenness, the lost pages, the active discouragement, the geographic hurdles, was this just the negligence of one uniquely corrupt, unreliable man?
Or was this a systemic feature, a bureaucracy designed to fail from the start?
Right. What do historians say about that?
Well, historians debate the balance, but the evidence overwhelmingly points to a systemic tolerance of his failure. Meaning you have clear individual misconduct by Ward. He was a terrible administrator. But you also have a broader federal apparatus in Washington that demonstrated total indifference to the Choctaw who were trying to remain.
I see.
When reports of Ward's obstruction reached the Capitol, the federal government didn't send auditors to investigate.
They didn't step in.
They didn't extend the 6-month deadline when it became abundantly clear the registration process was a shambles.
They just accepted the flawed, incomplete register Ward eventually produced.
Yes, and proceeded as if everyone not on that list was legally obligated to pack up and leave.
So the broader system was perfectly happy to accept the outcome of the corrupt clerk's actions because it aligned with their broader goal of total removal.
Precisely.
This is exactly what we mean when we talk about the machinery of paperwork. To strip tens of thousands of acres from families who had a legal, treaty-bound right to be there, the United States didn't need to deploy a cavalry unit.
No.
They didn't need to fire cannons into villages. They just needed a single, unreliable clerk, a hostile administrative environment, and a missed deadline.
The quiet breaking of that written promise stranded thousands of people.
Congress eventually tried to fix this, right, in 1842.
They did, yeah. Passing an act authorizing land patents or financial scrip for those Choctaws who could prove they had attempted to comply with Article 14 but were thwarted by the agent.
But by 1842, a full decade later, the original land was gone.
Heavily settled and cultivated by white Americans.
A piece of paper offering financial compensation a decade after you've been driven from your farm is a very, very poor substitute for the original promise of a homeland.
Very poor. And, the administrative failure of Article 14 created a class of dispossessed Choctaws who remained in Mississippi as landless squatters.
Yeah.
But for the majority of the Choctaw Nation, the reality was the physical removal process based on the broader terms of the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty.
Right. And the Choctaw removal was carried out in 3 main stages, beginning in the fall of 1831 and stretching through 1833.
The logistics were managed by the War Department, and their execution was woefully, tragically inadequate.
The military basically treated this logistics operation essentially like moving cargo, rather than transporting thousands of vulnerable families, including the elderly and infants.
Exactly. Immigrants were gathered at points like Memphis and Vicksburg to await transport across the Mississippi River and up the Arkansas River via steamboats.
And the War Department had vastly underestimated the costs and the sheer volume of supplies needed.
Vastly. Contracts for food were awarded to the lowest bidders, resulting in spoiled meat and inadequate corn rations.
Unbelievable.
Furthermore, the winter of 1831 to 1832 was one of the most severe on record. They were hit by severe floods, sleet, and freezing snow.
At one point, the Mississippi River was so choked with ice that steamboat traffic was halted for weeks.
Leaving thousands of Choctaws stranded in open-air encampments on the riverbanks without adequate tents or blankets.
When you have thousands of people exposed to freezing conditions, weakened by a lack of food and sheer exhaustion, disease is just inevitable.
Yes. Cholera and dysentery swept through the camps and the crowded, unsanitary decks of the steamboats.
Keeping our tone sober and documentary style here, the statistics of the suffering are undeniable. Record-keeping on the trail was poor, but historians generally estimate that of the roughly 15,000 Choctaw who set out on this journey, between a quarter and a third of them died.
A quarter to a third. That is, thousands of lives extinguished not in battle, but through exposure, starvation, and disease during a federally managed transit.
And it is from this specific Choctaw experience, documented by a witnessing Arkansas journalist who noted the tears and death along the route, that the phrase Trail of Tears and Death originally emerged.
Right, before being widely applied to the Cherokee experience later on.
Amidst this overwhelming logistical and human catastrophe, we have a primary voice that survived the era, providing incredible insight into the mindset of the Choctaw leadership as this was happening.
George W. Harkins.
Yes, George W. Harkins. He was a Choctaw district chief. In February of 1832, while he was literally aboard a removal steamboat in the middle of this winter nightmare, he wrote a public farewell letter to the American people.
It is a phenomenal primary source. Harkins was highly educated, fluent in English, and deeply aware of how to communicate with the American public.
He didn't just write this for his own people, did he?
No, he published this letter in American newspapers. He wanted the citizens of the United States to understand exactly what their legal machinery was doing, stripping away the sanitized political rhetoric of the time.
I want to quote directly from his letter because his words carry so much more weight than any summary we could give. He writes about the impossible choice the Choctaw faced. He says that they, quote, rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice could not be heard in their formation.
Notice how Harkins is directly addressing that pro-removal steelman argument we discussed earlier.
The rescue mission argument.
Right. The proponents in Congress claimed they were saving the Choctaw from oppressive state laws. Harkins acknowledges the reality of that oppression, the degrading influence of living under Mississippi laws, where the Choctaw had no democratic voice, no right to testify, no legal standing.
He agrees that staying under those conditions was subjugation.
But he explicitly rejects the federal narrative of a rescue. He frames the departure as a bitter exile chosen over slavery. He completely dismantles the illusion of a happy mutual land swap.
He also writes so powerfully about the physical land itself. He says, here is the land of our progenitors, and here are their bones, yet we cannot stay.
Yeah.
The tone is what strikes me. There is no unhinged rage. There is no melodrama. It is a document of profound, piercing dignity.
It really is.
He is a leader explaining with agonizing clarity to the very people who are removing him exactly what is being taken. He lays the moral weight of the treaty entirely on the American public.
And that dignified tone was highly strategic. He was appealing to the conscience of the American Republic, holding up a mirror to a nation that prided itself on liberty and justice, and showing them the cold reality of their bureaucratic expansion.
The Choctaw experience demonstrated how removal operated through administrative loopholes, a broken exit clause betrayed by a clerk, and a supposedly voluntary journey turned into a death march by logistical incompetence.
Which brings us to the Cherokee Nation.
Right. The Cherokee watched what happened to the Choctaw at Dancing Rabbit Creek. They saw the broken promises of Article 14 and the horrors of the winter migration.
And their response to the Indian Removal Act was entirely different.
Where the Choctaw narrative hinged on the desk of an Indian agent in Mississippi, the Cherokee narrative centers on a direct constitutional challenge in the highest court in the land.
And the architect of this unprecedented strategy was Principal Chief John Ross.
John Ross is one of the most fascinating political figures of the 19th century.
Absolutely. He was of mixed Scottish and Cherokee descent, highly educated and bilingual. He understood the internal traditional workings of the Cherokee Nation just as intimately as he understood the political and legal language of Washington, D.C.
Under his leadership, and building upon the earlier work of figures like Sequoyah, who created the Cherokee syllabary, the Cherokee Nation had established a formal, written constitution in 1827.
Modeled heavily on the U.S. Constitution, in fact.
Right. They had a bicameral legislature, a Supreme Court, and a written legal code.
They were deliberately and systematically proving their civilization to the United States. They're basically saying, you claim you want to civilize us. We have a constitution, we have a newspaper, we have thriving farms and schools.
And when the state of Georgia ramped up its oppressive laws, creating the Georgia Guard to intimidate Cherokee citizens, abolishing the Cherokee government, and making it a crime for the Cherokee Council to meet John Ross, decided on a radical strategy.
Very radical for the time.
He decided to fight the United States government not with weapons on a battlefield, but by using the United States' own legal system against it.
It was a brilliant, highly sophisticated maneuver. Ross hired prominent American attorneys, including William Wirt, a former U.S. Attorney General, to take the state of Georgia to the Supreme Court.
They initiated two of the most foundational cases in American legal history regarding native sovereignty. The first was Cherokee Nation v. Georgia in 1831. The Cherokee Nation asked the Supreme Court for an injunction to stop Georgia from executing its oppressive laws within Cherokee territory. They argued that they were a foreign state under the U.S. Constitution, which would give the Supreme Court original jurisdiction to hear the case.
Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for the court, faced a massive political dilemma here. He ultimately declined jurisdiction, ruling that the Cherokee did not qualify as a foreign state in the strict constitutional sense required to bring the suit directly to the Supreme Court.
So it was a loss on a jurisdictional technicality.
It was. But Marshall didn't just throw the case out and dismiss the Cherokee as having no rights. He did something much more complex.
He threaded a very delicate legal needle, didn't he?
He really did. While denying them foreign state status, Marshall explicitly defined the Cherokee as a domestic dependent nation. He established a framework that still governs Native American law today. He declared that the Cherokee were a distinct political society, capable of managing their own affairs, but existing within the territorial boundaries of the U.S. He described the relationship as resembling that of a ward to his guardian.
Most importantly, Marshall explicitly stated that the Cherokee had an unquestionable right to their lands until they voluntarily ceded them.
Right. They were not mere occupants or tenants on Georgia's land. They were distinct people with real legal standing.
And that set the stage perfectly for the definitive showdown just a year later, Worcester v. Georgia in 1832.
Because the Cherokee themselves couldn't sue as a foreign state, Ross and his legal team needed a test case involving a U.S. citizen to bypass that jurisdictional hurdle.
Enter Samuel Worcester.
Samuel Worcester, yeah. He was a white Christian missionary living among the Cherokee, operating a post office, and translating religious texts into the Cherokee language.
And the state of Georgia, trying to isolate the Cherokee from their white allies, had passed a law requiring any white person living in Cherokee territory to obtain a license from the state and swear an oath of loyalty to Georgia.
Worcester, coordinating with John Ross, deliberately refused to get the license or swear the oath. He argued that Georgia had absolutely no jurisdiction on Cherokee land.
Georgia's response was brutal.
Very brutal.
They arrested Worcester, tried him, and sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor in a Georgia penitentiary. He was put in a chain gang.
And by appealing his criminal conviction to the Supreme Court, Worcester provided the perfect vehicle. because he was a U.S. citizen appealing a state criminal conviction, the Supreme Court unquestionably had jurisdiction.
Chief Justice Marshall now had to rule on the core fundamental issue. Does the state law of Georgia apply within the borders of the Cherokee Nation?
In March of 1832, John Marshall delivers what looks on paper to be an absolute, resounding historic victory for the Cherokee.
Marshall rules that the Cherokee Nation is a distinct community occupying its own territory with boundaries accurately described. And then he drops the hammer on Georgia.
He does.
He declares that the laws of Georgia can have no force within that territory. He rules that Worcester's conviction is void because the state of Georgia has no constitutional authority to legislate over the Cherokee Nation.
That authority, he declares, belongs exclusively to the federal government and can only be exercised through mutual treaties.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The ruling in Worcester v. Georgia was a monumental vindication of John Ross's strategy. On paper, it was flawless.
Flawless, yeah. The highest court in the land had recognized Cherokee borders, affirmed their sovereignty against state intrusion, and told the state of Georgia it was acting illegally and unconstitutionally.
Let's think about this in terms of contract law or local zoning for a second.
Okay.
Imagine a massive corrupt development corporation decides they want your neighborhood. They forge documents, they send thugs to harass your neighbors, and they start tearing down fences. You don't fight them in the street. You spend years and all your money taking them to the highest appellate court. And finally, the chief judge bangs his gavel and says, the neighborhood wins. The corporation's actions are entirely illegal. They have no jurisdiction here.
You walk out of that courthouse holding a piece of paper that says your homes are saved.
Exactly. John Ross held that paper.
John Ross and the Cherokee leadership celebrated. They genuinely believed the system had worked. The Republic of Laws had functioned as designed.
But then you take that piece of paper back to your neighborhood and you watch as the corporation's bulldozers just roll in anyway, destroying houses while the judges sit silently hundreds of miles away.
Because that is the crisis of enforcement we run into next.
Right. A Supreme Court ruling is just ink on parchment unless the executive branch, the president, uses the power of the federal government to enforce it.
And the executive branch fundamentally abdicated its constitutional duty.
The state of Georgia completely ignored the Supreme Court's ruling.
Completely. They kept Samuel Worcester in the penitentiary. They continued to survey Cherokee land, continued to harass Cherokee citizens, and continued to operate their land lotteries.
And President Andrew Jackson refused to intervene. He refused to send federal marshals or the U.S. Army to enforce the court's decision, free Worcester, or protect the Cherokee borders.
Now, we need to pause here to address a massive historical myth.
Oh, yes.
Anyone who has taken a high school history class has probably heard a specific quote attributed to Andrew Jackson in this exact moment.
The famous line, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it.
Right. Did Jackson actually say that?
That's the question.
It is almost certainly apocryphal. There is no contemporary evidence, no letter, no diary entry from 1832 indicating Jackson ever uttered those exact words.
Wait, really? So where did it come from?
That specific phrasing didn't appear in print until decades later, in 1865, written by Horace Greeley, a fierce critic of Jackson looking to paint him as an unhinged tyrant.
So what did Jackson actually say or write about the ruling?
What Jackson actually wrote in a private letter to his friend John Coffey was much colder, much more bureaucratic, and in a way, far more chilling than a temper tantrum.
What did he write?
He wrote that the Supreme Court's decision had fell stillborn.
Fell stillborn.
Yeah. He calmly noted that the court could not coerce Georgia to yield to its mandate without the executive sword. Jackson was simply making a calculated observation of raw power. He knew the court had no army. He controlled the army.
And he was not going to deploy it to protect Cherokee sovereignty against a southern state, especially during an election year when he needed southern political support.
Exactly.
This is the darkest, most terrifying lesson of the Cherokee legal cases. It reveals a structural vulnerability in the very concept of a government of laws. John Ross played by the rules.
He used the legal machinery perfectly.
He secured a Supreme Court ruling that was morally right and legally definitive, and it was utterly, completely worthless without the executive will to enforce it.
The law had spoken. The highest judges had weighed in. And power, the raw physical power of the state of Georgia and the deliberate inaction of the federal executive simply carried on as if the ruling did not exist.
John Ross had won the legal battle and lost the physical war simultaneously.
And the realization that the Supreme Court victory was hollow sent a shockwave of panic through the Cherokee leadership.
Up until this point, the Cherokee Nation had been remarkably united under John Ross in resisting removal.
But as the 1830s grind on, as Georgia literally auctions off Cherokee farms while families are eating dinner inside them, a small faction begins to break away.
They realize the law won't save them.
Right. And that desperation creates a tragic, fatal fracture. This faction becomes known as the Treaty Party.
The key figures in this faction were Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, who had been the editor of the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. History often paints these men as cartoon villains, as greedy traders who simply sold out their people for a pile of gold.
But that flattens a deeply complex, agonizing historical reality. We have to view the Ridges and Boudinot as desperate pragmatists facing an impossible scenario.
Major Ridge had actually fought alongside Andrew Jackson decades earlier at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, right?
He had. He knew the military power of the United States. John Ridge and Elias Boudinot were highly educated, having attended school in Connecticut. They had experienced intense white racism firsthand.
So they looked at the unenforced Supreme Court ruling, the encroaching, violent white settlers, and the absolute refusal of the federal government to intervene, and they concluded that removal was now an absolute, undeniable inevitability.
Their logic was fundamentally a triage operation. They believed the United States was going to take the land by force no matter what John Ross or the Supreme Court said.
And they believed that if the Cherokee Nation just sat there and waited for the army to show up, they would be driven out with nothing.
Nothing at all. No financial compensation, no supplies, no legally guaranteed land in the West, and likely a massive loss of life in a disorganized, violent clash.
So they believed it was their tragic duty as leaders to secure the best possible terms while they still possessed some leverage.
Exactly. They wanted to negotiate a treaty that provided millions of dollars, guaranteed Western territory, and provisions for the journey before removal was imposed at the point of a bayonet. They wanted to control the fall.
But there is a fatal, insurmountable flaw in their plan, which leads us to December 29th, 1835, and the Treaty of New Echota.
The fatal flaw.
The fatal flaw was that the Treaty Party possessed absolutely no legal authority from the Cherokee Nation to negotiate or sign any document whatsoever.
None at all. John Ross was the elected principal chief. The elected National Council held the sole constitutional authority to make treaties.
Major Ridge and his allies were a minority faction acting entirely on their own.
It was a profound breach of Cherokee law. In December 1835, U.S. treaty commissioners called a meeting at the Cherokee capital of New Echota.
And John Ross advised the Cherokee people to boycott the meeting to deny it any legitimacy. Right.
He did, and the vast majority, thousands of Cherokee citizens, stayed home. Only a few hundred individuals, mostly aligned with the Treaty Party, actually attended.
And yet this unauthorized, unrepresentative group proceeded to sign the Treaty of New Echota.
By its terms, they ceded all remaining Cherokee land east of the Mississippi River to the United States for $5 million and new territory in the West.
This is staggering. They signed a document giving away the entire country, knowing they didn't have the authority to do so. It was fundamentally illegitimate.
Completely illegitimate.
I liken it to a case of massive mortgage fraud. It's as if I walked into a bank, claimed to represent you, signed a mortgage on your house, took the cash, and then the bank decided that because I live on your street and my signature is on the paperwork is valid and you are legally evicted.
The analogy is apt because the U.S. commissioners knew perfectly well that the signers lacked constitutional authority.
The Treaty Party themselves knew they lacked authority.
But the United States government didn't care about Cherokee constitutional nuances. They finally had exactly what they needed, a piece of paper with Cherokee signatures on it. They had the bureaucratic illusion of consent required by the Indian Removal Act.
John Ross didn't just throw his hands up when he learned about this fraudulent treaty, though. He mounted a massive, incredibly organized democratic pushback.
He rejected the treaty completely.
He organized the Cherokee people to demonstrate to Washington, D.C. just how entirely fraudulent the document was. Ross and his allies drafted a formal petition to the U.S. Senate, urging them not to ratify the Treaty of New Echota.
And they didn't just send a letter. They took this petition around the Cherokee Nation, riding on horseback through the mountains, gathering physical signatures.
The logistical effort behind this petition is astounding. They gathered nearly 16,000 signatures.
To put that in context, the entire population of the Cherokee Nation in the East at that time was estimated to be roughly 16,000.
Wow. So it was an overwhelming, nearly unanimous rejection of the treaty by the very people it purported to represent.
It was undeniable, physical proof of the fraud. John Ross took this massive scroll of parchment directly to the U.S. Congress.
So picture the scene in the U.S. Senate in May of 1836. On one desk, they have the Treaty of New Echota, signed by a few dozen unauthorized individuals in a boycotted meeting. On the other desk, they have a massive physical petition containing 16,000 signatures from the actual Cherokee people screaming, "This is a fraud! Do not ratify this!"
And the debate on the Senate floor was fierce. Prominent senators like Henry Clay and Daniel Webster passionately argued against the treaty, explicitly calling it a fraud and a stain on the nation's honor.
They knew it was illegitimate. And yet the Senate votes on ratification. It requires a two-thirds majority to pass.
And it passed. It achieved the necessary two-thirds majority by exactly one single vote.
So what does this all mean? How can a democratic institution look at 16,000 signatures from the people directly affected, openly acknowledge in their own floor debates that the signers had no authority, and still ratify the document?
Because the United States didn't ultimately want justice. It wanted a legally defensible mechanism to acquire the land. That single Senate vote worked a kind of dark bureaucratic alchemy.
Dark alchemy, I like that phrasing.
The moment the gavel fell, that one vote magically transformed an illegitimate, fraudulent piece of paper into the supreme law of the land, the binding legal basis for military removal.
Once it was ratified, the executive branch could shrug and say, "Our hands are tied. It's the law."
We have a ratified treaty, and we are legally obligated to execute it. It removed the moral burden from the perpetrators and hid it behind the shield of constitutional procedure.
Which brings us to the physical reality of what that single vote unleashed. The paperwork is complete, the legal cover is secured. It is now May of 1838. Andrew Jackson is out of office, and his successor, President Martin Van Buren, is in charge.
The Treaty of New Echota had included a 2-year grace period for the Cherokee to move voluntarily.
Most of them, following John Ross's advice, had refused to move, desperately hoping the fraudulent treaty would be overturned or delayed.
When the 2-year deadline expired, President Van Buren ordered General Winfield Scott to enforce the treaty.
General Scott arrives in Cherokee territory with roughly 7,000 U.S. Army troops and state militia. His orders are to execute a massive procedural roundup.
The military moved systematically through Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and North Carolina. Families were often surprised at dinner or working in their fields, forced from their homes at bayonet point with only the clothes on their backs.
They were herded into makeshift, heavily guarded stockades, effectively concentration camps to await transport west.
The conditions in these stockades were horrific even before the march began. It was the sweltering heat of the summer of 1838.
Putting 16,000 traumatized people into cramped, unsanitary stockades with inadequate food and water led to immediate outbreaks of dysentery and other diseases.
People were dying by the hundreds in the camps before they ever took a step west. Eventually, John Ross negotiated with General Scott to allow the Cherokee to manage their own removal logistics,
shifting the migration to the fall and winter to avoid the summer disease. But even then, the suffering was unimaginable.
The logistics of the Cherokee Trail of Tears involved multiple routes, some over land and some utilizing rivers. The winter of 1838 to 1839 brought freezing rain and snow. Clothing and blankets were insufficient. Wagons broke down.
Again, keeping our tone strictly documentary, historians estimate the deaths clustering around 4,000.
The generally accepted scholarly range is between 2,000 and 4,000 dead, though some estimates push higher if you count those who died of disease shortly after arriving in Indian Territory.
Even at the conservative end, you are talking about the annihilation of a massive percentage of the entire population.
Yes.
And the crucial point to make, connecting this back to the core theme of our deep dive, is that these 4,000 deaths were not the casualties of a battlefield clash. They were the direct statistical result of enforcing the Treaty of New Echota.
Every person who died of dysentery in a Georgia stockade, every elder who froze on the trail in Missouri, every child who succumbed to disease died because a single Senate vote ratified a piece of paper signed by men with no authority.
The paperwork killed them just as surely as a bullet would have.
That is the profound tragedy of bureaucracy. It distances the decision-maker from the death.
The senator who cast the deciding vote in a comfortable chamber in Washington, D.C. doesn't have to dig the shallow graves in the frozen mud of the trail.
The bureaucratic procedure sanitized the violence.
And the reckoning for this tragedy didn't just happen between the U.S. and the Cherokee. There was a terrifying internal reckoning within the Cherokee Nation itself once they finally reached the new Western Territory in present-day Oklahoma.
The nation arrived fractured, traumatized, and mourning thousands of dead. And they remembered exactly who had signed the piece of paper that brought this destruction upon them.
On the morning of June 22, 1839, a coordinated series of assassinations took place across the new territory.
The targets were the leaders of the Treaty Party. In 3 separate locations on the same day, they were hunted down.
Major Ridge was ambushed and shot while riding his horse along a road. His son, John Ridge, was dragged from his bed and brutally stabbed to death in front of his family. Elias Boudinot was attacked and killed with knives and hatchets outside his home.
Of the main leaders, only Stan Waddy, Boudinot's brother, managed to survive the coordinated attacks by being warned in time.
What struck me when researching these assassinations in Oklahoma is that this wasn't just random mob violence or unthinking revenge. They were executing these men under a specific, established Cherokee statute, the Blood Law.
Yes, this law explicitly made the unauthorized cession of communal land a capital offense.
The Blood Law is absolutely critical to understanding the events of June 1839. The Cherokee Nation had a long-standing legal tradition, which had actually been formalized and put into writing years earlier.
The law stated unequivocally that the land belonged to the entire Cherokee Nation communally. Therefore, any individual or faction who negotiated the unauthorized sale or cession of Cherokee land to the United States was guilty of treason against the nation.
And the mandated penalty for that treason was death?
So, when the Treaty Party signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835, they knew they were committing a capital offense in their own legal system.
Major Ridge is actually reported to have said when he signed the treaty, "I have signed my death warrant."
He knew it perfectly well.
Mm.
And this is the ultimate, bitter, tragic irony of the Treaty Party.
How so?
The Ridges and Boudinot had actually been instrumental in drafting and enforcing the Blood Law earlier in their careers to prevent lower chiefs from selling off land piecemeal.
Wow, really?
Yes. Yet they broke that very law because they genuinely, pragmatically believed it was the only way to save their people from total physical annihilation by the U.S. military.
They thought they were sacrificing their own lives and reputations to secure a future for the nation in the West.
But they were ultimately executed under that very same Cherokee law. They were held accountable by their fellow citizens for the thousands of deaths their unauthorized signatures set in motion.
They tried to use a U.S. legal mechanism, a treaty, to bypass a Cherokee legal mechanism, the Blood Law, and in the end, the Cherokee law claimed them.
It is one of the most profound internal ruptures in the history of this era, a nation divided, bleeding, and mourning, all stemming from one fraudulent piece of paper.
It is an incredibly heavy history to synthesize, but the through line of our deep dive is glaringly clear. When we look at documents like the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek for the Choctaw or the Treaty of New Echota for the Cherokee, we are not looking at protective pacts or mutual agreements between sovereigns.
We are looking at the bureaucratic machinery of displacement.
We've seen how a broken exit clause administered by a single negligent clerk in Mississippi stranded thousands of Choctaw families and turned a supposedly voluntary migration into a trail of tears and death.
And we've seen how a one-vote ratification of an explicitly unauthorized fraudulent treaty doomed the Cherokee Nation.
That bureaucratic maneuver completely neutralized Chief John Ross's brilliant, perfectly executed, but ultimately unenforced Supreme Court victory in Worcester v. Georgia.
The highest constitutional law of land was ignored, while a fraudulent contract was enforced with brutal military precision.
Which leaves me, and hopefully leaves you listening, with a final provocative thought to mull over. When we look back at the historical timeline, when we look for atrocities, we are heavily conditioned to look for villains holding weapons.
Right. We look for the dictators giving speeches, the generals on horseback, the soldiers pulling triggers on the front lines.
But this history asks us to shift our gaze. It asks us to look closely at the clerks shuffling papers on a desk. It asks us to look at the senators debating procedural rules on a marble floor.
It asks us to look at the quiet, mundane, bureaucratic loopholes and the missing pages of a registry.
If the greatest atrocities, the forced displacement, the deaths of thousands of people, the fracturing of entire nations can be committed entirely under the color of law, clothed in the respectable garments of treaties and ratifications, how should that change the way we scrutinize the powerful legal documents, the international treaties, and the sprawling bureaucratic systems operating in our world today?
Are we paying enough attention to the paperwork?
Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.